Part 1. Napoleon's Final Diary, The Lost Words of a Legend. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a lonely rock in the South Atlantic, a place so far from everything that even the waves seem to sigh with boredom. The year is 1815. And a man who once commanded Europe now wakes up each morning to the sound of seagulls arguing over fish guts. Did their best to keep him entertained. They'd play cards, discuss old battles, and occasionally pretend they weren't stuck on a rock where even the grass looked like it wanted to leave. Napoleon often joked, "We are a court without a kingdom," or decent wine. The laughter, soft and polite, echoed strangely in the damp halls. Writing his own legend. Napoleon never believed in dying quietly. Even in exile, he was composing the story of his life, or more accurately, revising it. His dictations to Bertrand and Montholon filled hundreds of pages. Every event, every battle, every triumph was retold with careful precision and a few convenient edits. Waterloo, for instance, was not a defeat. It was an unfortunate weather event. Russia? A strategic miscommunication with nature. And Josephine? Well, she remained the only woman who truly understood destiny. He often said, "History will do me justice." What he meant was, "I'll do it myself." Conversations with the wind. Sometimes he'd walk out alone, across the hill behind Longwood, where the grass bent low under constant wind. He called it his parliament. The wind, the sea, and the occasional seagull were his only ministers. He'd pace for hours, muttering to himself about Europe's new rulers, kings and princes, those powdered mannequins he called them. He'd laugh softly. They needed 30 nations to defeat one man. How efficient of them. Then the laughter would fade, and he'd stare toward the horizon, the endless blue, empty as the throne he once held. The doctor's visits. Napoleon's health began to falter, slowly, like a candle running out of wick. He complained of pain in his stomach, fatigue, and a strange heaviness that no medicine could ease. His British doctor, Barry O'Meara, tried his best, which in 19th century medicine meant offering more mercury and hope. Napoleon, skeptical as ever, often waved him away. "You doctors," he said once, "are like generals, always confident before the disaster." Still, there were moments of vulnerability. Quiet, brief moments when the once invincible man rubbed his chest, breathing shallowly, eyes half lost in thought. He never admitted fear, only fatigue. On regret, when asked if he regretted anything, Napoleon smiled, the tired, lopsided smile of someone who's already rewritten the past in his head. "I regret," he said, "that I trusted men too much. Especially the ones who smiled." He paused, watching the gray horizon. Power is a strange mistress. She loves only those who already have her. Sometimes he'd talk about his soldiers, my children, he called them, and how they died believing the world could be rebuilt by courage alone. His voice would soften then, just a little. "They fought for an idea," he murmured one evening, "and ideas don't bury their dead." The ghosts of Europe Longwood was never quiet. Not really. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind seemed to bring a whisper from somewhere else. From Vienna, from Paris, from the endless fields where the drums had stopped beating. Napoleon often spoke to those ghosts as if they were old acquaintances. To Wellington, "You fought well for a man who let the weather do half the work." To Talleyrand, "May your diplomacy keep you warm in hell." To Josephine, "If I had listened to you, perhaps I would still have an empire, or at least better furniture." He laughed softly, then sighed. It's remarkable how memory becomes kinder the farther you get from power. Nights of reflection. At night, he rarely slept deeply. The island air was too damp, the bed too narrow, and his mind too crowded. He'd lie awake, listening to the ticking of a clock, a sound he once associated with order, and now with decay. Sometimes he'd dream of his son, the King of Rome, now growing up far away, surrounded by the same royal families that once cursed his father's name. He imagined him tall, noble, perhaps wearing a simple uniform, but mostly he imagined him free. That thought, he said once, is my last victory. Letters that never arrived. Mail service to St. Helena was famously unreliable, mostly because nobody wanted to go there. Weeks could pass without a single letter. When one did arrive, it was usually months old, yellowed and creased. The ink faded like the sender's hope. Napoleon read them slowly, savoring each line. He'd smile at news of Europe, a wedding, a coronation, a treaty, and respond as if it all still concerned him. Then, when the letter was done, he'd fold it neatly and place it in a box. For history, he said. That box, they say, contained hundreds of unsent drafts, words written by a man still commanding armies of memory. Part 3. Napoleon's Final Diary. The lost words of a legend, mortality, memory, and the quiet descent into peace. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're returning once again to that lonely island where even the wind seems to have grown tired of talking. Napoleon is now in his 50s, though he feels much older. The grand strategist who once commanded a continent now spends most of his days staring at the horizon, waiting for ships that never come. Let's drift back to Longwood House, where the air is damp, the walls creak, and the greatest military mind of modern Europe is losing a battle with time. Fading strength. It began slowly, a stiffness in the legs, a dull ache in the stomach, the occasional dizzy spell that left him sitting by the window for hours, too weak to stand. His aides noticed first how he moved more carefully now, how his appetite shrank. When asked if he was in pain, he replied softly, "Pain is a loyal soldier. It refuses to desert." He laughed faintly, but the humor was thin, the kind that exists only to disguise fear. Dr. O'Meara, before being dismissed by the British authorities, had long suspected something serious. The new doctors offered polite concern and useless tonics. Napoleon, who distrusted medical optimism, once muttered, "They treat me as if I were a plant. Water, rest, and sunlight. I am not growing. I am fading." There. Diary of Decline. He began keeping a small notebook, plain leather, pages already curling at the edges. It wasn't a military diary or a political memoir, just small, wandering thoughts. One entry read, "The island has no seasons, only gray. Perhaps that is fitting." Another, "A man spends his life building a name, then spends his exile watching it decay." His handwriting was smaller now, tighter, as though conserving space, as though he knew he was running out of it. The ritual continues. Despite the weakness, Napoleon clung to routine, the last empire he could still command. He dressed neatly every morning, insisting his servants address him as emperor, not from vanity, but from habit. Identity, he said, was a uniform one should never take off, even when it no longer fits. Breakfast was simple: coffee, dry bread, and silence. The others tried to fill the air with conversation, but Napoleon preferred the stillness. Talking, he said, is what people do when they fear their own thoughts. The dream of return. Sometimes, when the island air was particularly soft, He'd imagine himself sailing back to France. He'd describe it vividly: the cool mist of the Channel, the cheers of the crowd, the distant bells of Paris. Perhaps, he mused once, they will welcome me back as a memory, if not as a man. His companions, devoted and delusional in equal measure, nodded eagerly. Yes, sire. One day, perhaps. He smiled faintly. One day is always such a polite lie. Then he'd close his eyes and let the sound of the sea take over the rest of the conversation. The Emperor and the Mirror. In the small study at Longwood stood a single mirror, its glass slightly warped. He'd stand before it sometimes, studying the reflection, not out of vanity anymore, but curiosity. This, he'd say softly, is what remains after glory has left the room. He would turn sideways, tracing the faint line of his old uniform on his chest, the outline of medals long gone. Do you know, he said once to Monttalon, that men used to look at me and see the future? He smiled at his own reflection. Now, even I can barely see the present. Conversations with death. As his condition worsened, Napoleon began to speak of death more openly, though not with fear. He treated it as he did everything else, analytically, strategically, with a touch of arrogance. Death is merely the next frontier, he said once. If I could, I'd conquer that too. One night, lying awake, he told his valet, Marchand, I feel death approaching. It's polite. It knocks softly, as if waiting for an invitation. Marchand, not knowing what to say, offered water. Napoleon smiled faintly. Ah, yes. A toast to the inevitable. Reflections on legacy. During one particularly quiet evening, he turned to Bertrand and asked, What do they say of me in Europe? Bertrand hesitated. They remember your victories, sire, and your defeats. Napoleon chuckled. Ah, balance. History's favorite lie. He leaned back, eyes half closed. They will argue about me for centuries. Some will curse me. Some will romanticize me. None will know me. Then, almost whispering, that is the curse of fame, to be remembered by strangers and forgotten by yourself. The philosophy of exile. With fewer visitors and even fewer letters, Napoleon spent his afternoons dictating small philosophical notes. They weren't about politics or war, but about the quiet absurdity of life. Men call ambition a fire, he wrote, but it is really a hunger, one that eats until it devours its own master. Those who seek immortality in history forget that even history forgets. The world does not end when you die. It merely becomes less interested. He often ended these thoughts with a single word: enough. A letter to his son. In March 1821, feeling weaker than ever, he dictated a letter to his son, the King of Rome. My dear son, I leave you no throne, but I leave you a name. Guard it, but do not worship it. Learn that power is not in the crown, but in the calm of the mind that wears it. And remember, greatness is a burden carried best by those who wish they never had it. He paused, then added, Tell him I forgive him for being born too late. The letter was never sent. The long goodbye. By late April 1821, Napoleon could barely rise from bed. The room smelled faintly of sea salt, ink, and damp linen. He spoke little, mostly in murmurs that drifted between memory and delirium. Once, he reached for a map that wasn't there, tracing invisible borders in the air. Europe, he whispered, always too small. His followers kept vigil, silent except for the occasional shuffle of boots and the whisper of prayers. When asked if he wanted a priest, he nodded gently. Even emperors, he said, need good references. And so, the emperor lay still, not yet gone, but already halfway into legend. The sea whispered against the rocks, the wind hummed its eternal song, and history itself seemed to pause. Respectfully, almost reluctantly. Next time, we'll drift into part 4, where we'll witness the final hours of Napoleon's life and the strange, quiet dignity with which he left the world he once tried to command. Part 4: The Emperor and His Ghosts. Hey everyone. Tonight, we drift again to that lonely island in the Atlantic, the one where power turned into memory, and a man once called Emperor learned what silence really sounds like. The sea around St. Helena is quiet, too quiet. Even the waves seem tired of repeating themselves. Napoleon sits by the small window of Longwood House, staring into the gray fog that swallows the horizon. The wind hums through the shutters like a half-forgotten melody, and for a moment he imagines it's the sound of marching drums from long ago. But of course, it's just the wind. It's always the wind. His desk is cluttered with papers he no longer needs, letters that never left the island, notes no one will read. He picks up a quill, dips it in the inkwell, and writes one line. If glory fades, then what remains? He stares at it for a while, then lets the ink dry without adding another word. The room is dim. The oil lamp flickers. He leans back in his chair, and for a fleeting second, he thinks he sees someone in the corner. Tall, proud, wearing the blue uniform of the Imperial Guard. A ghost of the past, maybe, or just memory pretending to be real. He mutters, almost to himself, "They never leave, do they?" The ghost doesn't answer. None of them ever do. Outside, the evening fog thickens. A few servants move quietly through the corridor, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the house, the rhythm of an exile slowly turning into legend. Let's drift, just a little, through the fog of his thoughts. He remembers Austerlitz, the frozen morning, the sun breaking through the mist, the roar of victory echoing over the snow. He remembers the faces of his soldiers, wide-eyed and young, believing him to be something more than human. And now, in this tiny, damp house, he can't decide if that memory comforts him or makes the silence worse. He whispers, "I was their destiny." But destiny has such a short memory. Sometimes he talks to the guards who stand outside his door. They nod politely, pretending to understand. But their English is too coarse for his French melancholy. He calls them "my new court," half joking, half resigned. When night falls, he writes again, notes to no one, reflections for no audience. "History will judge me," he writes, "but it never asks me first." He stares at the page for a while, the lamplight trembling. His handwriting looks weaker now, as if even the ink has grown tired. He dreams of Josephine sometimes. In the dream, she walks through the garden of Malmaison, her perfume mixing with the scent of rain. She doesn't speak, she only smiles, the kind of smile that forgives everything. When he wakes, the smile fades first, and then the garden, and then everything. "Why do ghosts always leave before morning?" he murmurs. No one answers. On some nights, he listens to the sailors outside, laughing by the docks. Their voices drift through the night like faint music, rough, ordinary, alive. He almost envies them. They have no empires to lose. The physician visits him every few days. He talks about medicine, about diet, about the island's damp air. Napoleon nods, pretending to listen, but he's really thinking about the one battle he can't win, the quiet one, fought against time itself. Sometimes he opens his old maps, spreading them across the table like old wounds. Every red line and black mark whispers a story. Cities burned, thrones toppled, people who once cheered his name and now pretend they never did. He traces one line with his finger, from Corsica to Moscow, and says softly, "Too far. I went too far." He doesn't regret ambition. He regrets believing that ambition could last forever. The nights grow longer. The sea grows louder. His diary fills with thoughts that sound more like confessions. He writes, "They will call me a monster, but monsters are only men whose mirrors are too honest." Sometimes he laughs at his own words, a slow, dry laugh that turns into a cough halfway through. Then silence again. The servants whisper that he speaks to shadows now. They say he greets them as if they were guests from another world, Duroc, lands, maybe even his mother. He calls them by name. He even apologizes sometimes. But in truth, the shadows are all he has left. When the candlelight flickers, he sees an entire court dancing through the smoke. Uniforms, medals, white gloves, the gleam of chandeliers. A whole empire that exists only between blinks. And yet, he isn't entirely sad. There's a strange calm in knowing that the world has already turned its page, and he is now just a footnote waiting to be read. He writes again, "Perhaps the afterlife is just history retelling itself until it gets it right." The ink spills a little on the page, a small black sea of its own. He leans back and closes his eyes. Outside, the ocean murmurs like an old friend trying to remember a story. Inside, the ghosts of his past stand quietly, waiting for him to speak again. But he doesn't. Not yet. Because he knows the story isn't done. Not tonight. There are still memories left to wander through. Letters to rewrite. Faces to remember. Mistakes to soften. The world has forgotten him. But he hasn't yet forgotten the world. He still remembers the warmth of power, the applause, the fear, the sense that every heartbeat could alter history. He exhales slowly. The lamp flickers one last time before the wick burns out, leaving the room in half-darkness. Somewhere beyond the fog, a ship's bell rings faintly. It reminds him of another life, a louder one, full of orders, drums, and marching feet. He almost smiles. "History," he whispers. "You've always been my only audience." The ghosts fade into the shadows. The sea keeps whispering, and the night, gentle as ever, folds itself around the last emperor like a blanket of forgotten dreams. Let's drift away from Longwood House for now. Not to say goodbye, not yet, but to prepare for what still lingers beyond the horizon. Because the diary isn't finished. Not until the horizon disappears. Part 5. The Quiet Reflections. Hey everyone. Still here, drifting along the foggy cliffs of St. Helena with me? Tonight, we linger on the quieter corners of Napoleon's mind, the moments that aren't recorded in history books, the ones that fade with the wind and the waves. By now, he has grown accustomed to the rhythms of exile. The island has settled into him as much as he has settled into it. The ocean wind, the slow creak of the shutters, the distant crash of waves. They are the only companions who do not demand allegiance, loyalty, or victory. Memories in repetition. Napoleon spends hours alone, seated at his small desk, dictating fragments to anyone willing to listen. Sometimes he smiles faintly at the repetition of old campaigns. Sometimes he sighs, realizing he can no longer command armies, only memories. Waterloo? A battle of poor coordination. Mostly to rain, he mutters, shaking his head with ironic amusement. Moscow? Naturally, they burned the city before I could complain. Typical Russians. He chuckles softly to himself. The humor is not loud. It's a small rebellion against the gravity of history. Even here, he maintains a kind of precision. Details, dates, minor victories. Perhaps it's less about pride and more about keeping some small part of order in a world that refuses it. Thoughts on power. He reflects often on what it meant to rule, not as a general, not as an emperor, but as a man burdened by ambition. Power, he whispers, is like holding sand. The tighter you grip, the more slips away. He thinks of the people he led, the nations he tried to shape. He wonders if any of it truly mattered beyond the immediate applause, the medals, the paper treaties. I commanded empires, yet could not command a single evening without interruption by illness or boredom. Some lesson there, I suppose? Sometimes he smiles faintly, because the irony of it all has not escaped him. Small pleasures. Even on this isolated rock, Napoleon discovers small comforts, a well-brewed cup of tea, held carefully to avoid spilling, watching the subtle shift of light on a hill as if the world were painting itself just for him. The occasional bird, hopping awkwardly along the garden path, reminding him that life continues, even for the smallest. He speaks softly to his companions about these things, sometimes as if confessing a secret. The sea. It does not care about empires, generals, or reputations. And yet it continues. Without apology, he admires this quietly. There's a humility here that never existed on the battlefield. Reflections on legacy. Napoleon often stares into his mirror, seeing not the legendary conqueror, but the man diminished by time, distance, and isolation. I am smaller than I remember, he admits to no one in particular. But still, someone will recall my name. Someone always does. He ponders what history will say. The hero, the tyrant, the genius, the fool. It matters little to him now. He has learned that legacy is less about the stories told by others and more about the quiet persistence of memory itself. Perhaps the wind will whisper my name long after the armies are dust. Nighttime contemplations. At night, he sits by the window, looking out at the endless gray horizon. The ocean stretches beyond comprehension, and for the first time, he understands the smallness of human ambition. I ruled men, yet could not rule this room, he murmurs. I commanded nations, yet could not command the weather. And here I sit, dictating memories to ghosts. His companions, listening in subdued awe, dare not speak. Even his words are gentle, slow, meant to be absorbed, not acted upon. Letters that will never leave. Napoleon writes letters that will never reach their recipients. To Josephine, in words that blend tenderness with regret. To his son, hoping to impart wisdom he once could not convey. To France, in fragmented notes that read like a dialogue with a shadow. Greater than, I leave my thoughts, not my orders, he confesses. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it is everything. The letters are carefully folded, never sent, preserved only in the hands of those who serve him. Even in this, he exerts control. He chooses what remains, what vanishes, and what drifts into the uncertain air of memory. Conversations with the sea. The sea has become his confidant. On quiet afternoons, he walks along the veranda, leaning on his cane, listening to waves that never tire. Greater than, they say water is passive, obedient. But it is more honest than generals, ministers, and kings, he muses. It always does what it will, without pretense or ceremony. Sometimes he laughs softly at this thought, imagining the irony of spending years trying to command men, only to find solace in something untamable and indifferent. Judgment without audience. In these long hours, he reflects on the choices he made, which battles were victories, which were disasters disguised as strategy, which alliances were mistakes, and then he smiles with dry amusement. Greater than, it seems, judgment is always easier when you're alone. No cheers, no complaints, just the occasional complaint from your stomach or your cane. Even the weight of his failures becomes a subject for quiet humor. Drift into silence. As evening falls, the wind picks up slightly. The candles flicker in Longwood House. Napoleon leans back in his chair, staring at the shadows that stretch along the walls. Greater than, perhaps tomorrow the wind will be gentler, or perhaps it will not. Either way, it will still be my world to observe, my empire to witness, and my thoughts to record. And with that, he closes his journal, the pages heavy with memory, humor, and faint melancholy. The night deepens. The sea continues its endless song. Napoleon drifts not toward sleep, but toward a quiet understanding of time, solitude, and the peculiar grace of fading power. Part 6. The Final Silence. Hey everyone, tonight we drift to the very end. The last days of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who once ruled empires, now a solitary figure on a remote island. We watch him not as a conqueror, but as a man quietly surrendering to time, to memory, and to the sea. The last days, spring, 1821. The days are slow, weighted, almost reluctant to pass. Napoleon's health has further declined. His strength is faint, his voice barely above a whisper. Servants tread softly around him. Companions sit quietly, knowing that even a sigh might disturb this fragile balance. "Do not hurry," he murmurs, almost to himself. "Time has slowed, as it always does, just for me." He moves with caution now, each step deliberate, a reminder that his body no longer answers his commands. Conversations with the horizon. Even now, the ocean is his confidant. He gazes at it for hours, listening to waves that seem to carry both judgment and forgiveness. They call me emperor, general, legend. Yet the sea knows me as simply another man, he whispers. The horizon offers no applause, no condemnation, only constancy. For someone who once measured worth in nations, this quiet impartiality is both humbling and strangely comforting. Gentle routine. Despite frailty, he clings to simple rituals. Morning tea, held carefully. A brief walk in the garden, supported by companions. Scribbling thoughts in his journal, which grows heavier with memory. Each act is small but deliberate. A subtle assertion of control over a world that has already moved on. Even in weakness, one can remain disciplined, he murmurs. Discipline is the last luxury a man can afford. Farewell to companions. He speaks softly to those who remain by his side. Bertrand, Montholon, and others. No grandeur, no commands, just quiet words, faintly ironic, tender, and aware of finality. You have been loyal, mostly out of necessity, but also out of friendship, he says, faintly smiling. Do not mourn me. History will do that poorly enough. There's a gentle humor in this, an acknowledgement that even after death, misinterpretation is inevitable. Reflection and acceptance. Napoleon reflects on his life, the victories, the mistakes, the ephemeral nature of power. Greater than I have been adored, feared, and hated, he muses. Yet here, none of it matters. Only memory, and the quiet understanding of limits. He contemplates the weight of ambition and the irony that a man who once commanded armies must now obey the frailty of his own body. Greater than, Perhaps the true empire is the one we build within ourselves, he whispers. Nature as witness. The garden, the wind, the ocean, they are constant observers. The birds hop along the paths. The trees sway gently. The sea stretches forever. In these small, indifferent presences, he finds a kind of companionship. They do not judge. They do not flatter. They merely are. Perhaps this is the truest audience, the end. Approaches April 5th, 1821. Napoleon is weaker than ever. Breathing is labored. Hands tremble. Eyes, once so sharp and commanding, now gaze softly at the ceiling. It is time, he murmurs, almost as if consulting the room. Time as it always has been, the final judge. His companions watch silently. They do not speak. Even the air seems to pause. Last thoughts. In his final hours, he reflects gently. To his son, wisdom, hope, and love. To his soldiers, gratitude, even in defeat. To history, humility, the acknowledgement that stories outlive men. Greater than I go, leaving only thoughts, words, and memory, he whispers. Let the wind carry what it must and forget what it chooses. There is no fear here, only quiet acceptance. Only the soft, slow understanding that even the greatest must rest. The final moment. As the day wanes, Napoleon lies back, the room calm, the candles flickering. He closes his eyes. Breath slows. The sea continues its endless rhythm. The wind whispers through the shutters. So ends the empire of one, and begins the empire of memory. And with that, he drifts away, not with a roar, not with drama, but with the quiet dignity that marked these last days. Legacy in silence. Napoleon's body will rest, but his words, his thoughts, his humor, and even his ironic musings on power and memory will remain. The island, the sea, the wind, they will carry echoes of a man who once tried to command the world, and in those echoes there is a strange, calm immortality. Closing. And so we leave him, not as a conqueror, but as a man. A man who laughed quietly at the absurdity of power, who reflected on life's fleeting nature, and who, in the end, found the soft, final silence he had never known on the battlefield. Sleep well, everyone. Let these quiet reflections drift with you into your own night.